Welcome to Murderabilia Exposed. I'm Andrew.
I'm Taylor. How's it going?
It's going. It's going. So today we wanted to talk about pricing out Murderabilia. That's probably one of the biggest questions that I get asked, and I know you get asked a lot.
Oh
And
yeah.
so much that goes into it from the case, rarity. Is it typed? Is it handwritten? Is it signed? Is it initial?
Mhm. Well, I was just telling you a minute ago that I was in an Uber yesterday, and the driver was talking to me about work, and we got into that. He's like, "How do you price this stuff?" And pretty much like a half-hour drive, all we talked about was how I figured that stuff out. So it's very fresh in my mind today.
So we can start out with talking about I guess the rarity, of letters or artwork or whatever. And
Mhm.
obviously, like we can take Jeffrey Dahmer, for instance. He wasn't in prison that long before he was murdered. And his stuff is, well, slim to none before you drop that Jeffrey Dahmer collection. But even then, even now, that stuff is still rare. And obviously the case
Mhm.
is worldwide news coverage, even back then when there wasn't really a lot of coverage on serial homicide cases. And
Mhm.
it all, whether it's a handwritten or typed. I know that, say a Jeffrey Dahmer type letter, there's a difference between what, like, say $1,000 to $3,000 of it being typed or handwritten or signed or initialed or unsigned or type signed.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, for him specifically, he's kind of a good baseline to start on. So he was in prison for 2 years, right? He only wrote to a couple of people compared to how many people wrote to him. So there are some letters out there from him. And then, early into his prison career, he got a typewriter. So he started typing everything, typing his name. He wouldn't sign it most of the time if he typed a letter. So if you wanted anything handwritten or with a signature, you had to get one of the original ones. Even his envelopes, he would type out. Um, so yeah, you got to think in the 2 years that he was in prison, then however many years since that happened, how many of those have been destroyed or thrown out or kept in storage. It's been almost 30 years, right? A lot of those letters are just gone. um, I think the market for letters going around has always been the same handful going between people's hands, right? And obviously I think the first time that any new ones have been introduced into the market is from this collection that I have, right? And it's still not a significant amount at all, just a small handful. But I'll get people messaging me all the time saying like, "Hey, can I get something signed by Jeff? I have like a $200 or $300 budget." And it's like, I mean, it would be great if that was the case, but his signature is extremely rare. He only wrote. I'm gonna make an estimate of maybe he wrote 100 to 200 letters at the absolute most, and probably a third of them still exist, and probably from that, only a third of those are known out to be out there publicly or have been traded or sold between people, right? It just one of the big factors is um, like how much the stuff was produced, right? And I've got more examples I'll get into, but yeah, it's a good starting point for sure that you got to think, okay, there's only a few of them. Then when you get into more kind of you know books that he signed that he wrote inside of, or personal possessions, things that become one of a kind, obviously the value goes up and up and up from there. But um, So maybe do you want to give a little summary or an explanation of how you at first started figuring out prices on things when you started listing stuff? Because obviously there's not a lot of comparisons to look at for these kind of items, right?
Yeah, so back in 2015 when I started True Crime Auction House, I had no idea what to price anything at. And instead of looking at other competitors, I just made up my own prices. Like, for instance, at the time I was writing like Wayne Henley, Robert Bardo, and Christopher Scarver, and so many other names. Like, I would go online, or I would go on Facebook in all these groups, and I'd see people selling Robert Bardo letters for, say, 30 letters or $30 or $40. So I would be like, okay, there's 20 Robert Bardo letters for sale. I'll put one up for $10, $15. And of course, the more scarce something is, the more money it's going to be. And of
Mm,
course, when somebody passes away, it's just like a celebrity signature. It'll go up in value. And I started, pricing my own stuff. And still to this day, I don't go off of what other people price things as. I go off of what I would pay, as a collector. And
Yeah.
not to say that I'm undercutting anybody by like hundreds of dollars or whatever, but I just feel like I price to what I would want to buy at as a collector, not as a reseller,
Mhm.
of course.
Yeah, you got to take into account with that, what people are willing to pay. Something's only really worth what somebody's going to pay, right? I could buy a Gacy painting and put it up for $25,000. Doesn't mean it's worth that. It means that's my current asking price. If it sold for that price, maybe it would shake the market up a bit. But um, you have to take into account what think would be reasonable for somebody to pay, and then what you paid for the item as well. For instance, I would say a majority of the stuff from my site is things that I've bought, and mostly from large collections that I've bought and then split up, or items that I've sourced and then split up separately, right? And I have to think, every once in a while I'll get a deal where it's like, oh, I got, let's say I got 100 letters from inmate X, right? And that person's letters are worth quite a bit, but I have so many of them and I paid such a low price that I can sell them for cheaper and still make a good profit. I also need to consider not devaluing the market because I don't want it to be that they're worth nothing anymore because a bunch of new ones came out. Um, and then that kind of, those rare situations where you'll find a really good deal where it's like, oh, I paid this much for all of this stuff. They have to take into the account the times that I've spent like $2, $3, $4,000 on one item and put it up on the site and it sat there for like a couple of years, right? And eventually there will be a buyer for it, but the profit margin is smaller. The initial investment is larger, and it's got to be relative to what you paid, right? I find it kind of balances out. I don't really look at items one by one for my profit margins. I kind of look at the collection as a whole, or the inventory as a whole, where it's like, well, I can do this a bit cheaper because I paid less, or I can have to do this a bit higher because I've got so much money in it, right?
When it comes to buying and when it comes to like buying small or big collections, and making your money back. Like for instance, a few years ago, I bought a Dennis Rader lot. And
Mm-hmm.
instead of selling the letters for $50 a piece, on the open market online, I would message certain collectors to sell under the table. For instance, say I spent $1,000 and I sold like 20 letters at 50 bucks a piece. Then I made my money back. Then I can list them, for what they're going for then. But
Mm-hmm.
like you said, you don't want to devalue anything. I mean, selling under the table is one thing, but as soon as you post something online for say 50% less, then automatically that drives the value down, whether it's Dahmer,
Yeah.
Gacy, Warnos, whoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very so I have like a background in kind of the general collectibles industry, right? With trading cards and retro games and vintage clothing and all these kind of like big staples of like collector stuff. And there's times when I go to a thrift store and find like an old dead stock vintage t-shirt for $4. The shirt's worth like $200 or $300, right? And then I'll be like, okay, that's a great score. I made a couple $100 profit. But then there's times when I, will spend like $10,000 on a collection of Pokemon cards that's worth maybe 15,000. So it's a $5,000 profit after a ton of work after a super long time, right? So you kind of have to make up for the fact that sometimes you're not making the maximum amount of money, but your certain things are kind of making up for that in the fact that the profit margins on certain things are higher. Um, like there's a handful of things that I found where it's like an insane deal for me, where I'm like, well, I can't believe I only paid this. I'll pay, the price of one hot profile letter, um, and I'll get three of them, and then I sell all three and I triple what I paid. But then there's other things where I spent, $4,000. I'm going to sell it for 4,500, or even eventually sometimes have to sell it for less at a loss because it's not moving. Just yeah. Um, to slightly go off of this a bit, I'm going to use a specific example here. So I got some Israel Keys items recently, right? And his case is he's obviously not a big name, but it's an interesting case and it's super unique and super rare. So he was arrested and killed himself while he was in jail. never wrote any letters, didn't go to trial, didn't go to prison, wasn't around making anything. The only thing really left behind was that he did some paintings that were in his cell when he died, and those are obviously just in police evidence, they're never going to be out publicly. But somebody contacted me who had worked with him and invoiced him for certain things, right? Because he had a contracting company. So I've got a small handful of these kind of contracting receipts, where it's got some handwriting from him. It's got like his company logo, keys contracting, super unique things. And it's just the only reason that these ever came to the market was somebody remembered, oh, I used to work with that guy at some point and dug these things out and sold them. For that kind of thing, there's zero things to compare to. I'll usually, if I get like a big high-end piece or like a very unique piece, I'll look at all the other sites that are out there to kind of see what people are asking or if there are things for sale. But for him, it's like there isn't anything, there hasn't ever been anything. So when it's a first to market kind of thing like that, you sort of had to figure that out for yourself, right? And in that case, I kind of look at, okay, what I paid, what I think I would pay as a collector. I had to kind of make it relative to, making the money back or making some profit on it, but also making sure that that's within a reasonable range where I'm not like just totally exploiting the item and making a ton of money on something that didn't cost me too much. I mean, it did in this case cost a lot, but it's all about kind of figuring out those ratios. And once you get like a huge inventory of stuff, like hundreds of items, it's hard to kind of keep track sometimes, but yeah, it's something that I like about the job. It makes it interesting for me where it's like, I don't feel like in any way that I control the market, but I have an understanding of how to bring new items into the market at a reasonable rate of what I think people would pay based on other things that I've sold. Makes it interesting, It's a very self-driven, independent job. Like there's only like 2 or 3 people that I know who I can like talk about this job with, that have the same perspective as me, because they have experience in it. Because for the most part, you're just kind of winging it as you go. It's such a unique, small niche thing. Another thing too there is that I'll often check in with people saying, "Hey, what have you sold these in the past for?" Because I know that certain people have dealt in certain names or certain collections more. So there's, you got like your people who are like the Wuornos people or the Manson people or Bundy people or Ramirez people who have dealt in those cases a lot and they have a better perspective on it, right? So it's nice to have a bit of networking where people are generally happy to talk about like, oh, I think you could get this, or I think that this will be worth that, in my opinion.
Right. And going off of that, prior to 2019, I hate to sound like a broken record, but there was not a whole lot of Sarah Aldretti, or Narco Satanico stuff on the market, and you could get a letter for like $300. But
Mm-hmm.
when I miraculously got a letter back from Sarah Aldretti, and then she later called me, we started doing business, and I started
Mm-hmm.
getting box after box after box. And at first, I was selling stuff for like a couple $100 a pop, but then I wasn't really selling a whole lot. And instead of selling 1 or 2 items, once or twice a year, I tend to like lower the prices with Aldretti, not making it super cheap, but not making it super expensive. Like for instance,
Mm-hmm.
like a signed note card with a lip print, you can get that for like $35-$40. And I'm
Yeah.
sure, 2019, 2018, that would have been up for like $200-$300. And I have
Mm-hmm.
probably totes and totes and totes of Aldretti. And I guess you could say it's rare in a sense, but I have, and I wouldn't say that I own the market or anything like that. And just, like you said, putting new things out there for people to collect and trade around. And,
Yeah.
it's always funny seeing things pop up, that I've put out there, years ago, or even with this Aldretti stuff, like it even makes its way back into my collection sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and there's a few times too where we've done deals specifically with Ramirez and Wernos because I bought a massive Ramirez collection a while ago. I know eventually those are all going to sell, but I know that if I have some variety, I want to cover as many cases as possible. So we traded at some point Wernos and Ramirez letters back and forth. So it was like you would have some Ramirez in your inventory, I'd have some Wernos because somebody might not know about your site or might not know about my site, or be drawn into the site because you have more variety, right? So there's definitely, I think, a lot of kind of behind the scenes dealings in this stuff, just in regards to making sure that there's still a sustainable market to be able to, make a profit. this is a hard thing to do full time, right? So anybody who's dedicating themselves to be doing this as a full time thing, you really got to be strategic um, about that kind of stuff. You know, like I find that sorry, I find that the amount of money I make is exactly relative to how much time and effort I put into the work, right? If I take a day off, I'm going to notice a drop in sales. If I'm actively, you know, trying to like lowering prices on older items or looking for new things or trying to make connections and trades and stuff, it keeps things, you know, keeps the money coming in, which I can then put into new items. Pretty much all of my kind of philosophy with the business from the beginning was like all the money was going to go back into it, aside from paying my bills and a bit of savings, you know, like a security net. And then that lets me like build up a bigger inventory and buy bigger things. And now, like this week, for instance, I spent $7,500 on 3 large items that I bought, and those 3 things are going to take a while to sell. But it's kind of like if I'm not doing that, then you know that's always like all my profits for a period of time equals out to being spent on just those 3 things. Eventually, those will bring in profits, which will get into this. And it's kind of just like a balancing the risk of how much stuff do I want to have on hand, how much money do I want to put out before I know I'm going to be making money back, and then for anything significant, my sales generally on average are between like I'll sell generally between $100 and $250 per order, um, either on like one small item or a few smaller items. Uh, but I look at that as kind of sustaining the larger sales, right? Whereas I'd rather be making like several $1,000 sales every single time. But the more I like wean out lower value things and go to the higher things, I'm obviously going to sell less because there's not as much money going around. But though that less number of sales will equate to the same amount of profits, right? All right. Yeah, it's definitely a very there's not a lot of comparisons in this business for how to look at things, especially if you're finding something for the first time to market, or something that you know nobody's ever seen before. Um, you just gotta fucking hope for the best.
Right. It's always exciting being the first one too, because you're like, I don't want to price it too high. I don't want to price it too low, you know. But
Yeah.
the good thing about that is like if nobody is, you know, biting, can continually lower the price over and over. I mean, that's what I used to
Mhm.
do with Aldretti at first, and now I just leave it where it is.
Yeah. That kind of touches on a little behind the scenes secret here for anyone who's listening to this and wants some little secret info. Anything that I have that's kind of higher value, I usually will list higher than I'm expecting to get on it. So I have some flexibility room, right? So somebody reaches out and says, hey, can we do a partial trade, or can you knock a bit off the price on this? I'll be able to give somebody a good deal, and then I'm still making what I was expecting to make. And um, yeah, they're getting a good deal and maybe come back as a return customer. But I definitely, for anybody doing any kind of like little business or side hustle or whatever you're doing, um, don't be afraid to price things a bit high and then have flexibility on it, as opposed to pricing it too low. It sells immediately, and you're like, oh shit, I could have gotten more for that. I've done that too, where I put things up for cheap and they go in an hour, and I'm like, well, you know, I made a profit on that, but definitely it wouldn't have hurt if that sat around for a bit longer. I could have gotten some more money on it, you know.
Right, right. And it's always and it's always risk reward with everything. Like say an inmate that's alive that you pay say $1,000 for 5 letters, and you're selling them like 250 a piece. This guy or gal could all of a sudden write everybody back like a Philip Jablonski or Wayne Henley and or
Mhm.
Dennis Rader, you know, for instance, like
Yeah.
when Dennis Rader stuff was not on the market, it was, you know, 3, 4, $500 for a letter. Now
Mhm.
you can get one for like 40, $50 sometimes if you're lucky.
Yeah. And then and he, you know, he's an older guy, he might die soon, and then when that happens, things are going to really change with that. He's an interesting guy. So when I first was doing this, I was writing a lot, and I don't sell any of my personal letters really. Not that I have a problem with it or anything. I just have too much other stuff to go through. So it's kind of just, you know, eventually I'll release that stuff. But he was one where I was like, okay, a lot of people get hear back from him. Not a ton, not everyone, but quite a few people. So I wrote him a lot. I wrote him quite like couple of times a month for a while, and eventually he sent me back a package, and it was huge, and it was like every letter and envelope I had sent him with notes on them and doodles on them. He sent me like some drawings. He sent me um, his own letters that he had written, a big inventory list of all the items that he sent me, like a ton of categorized things. It was probably like 15 or 20 different pieces that came back to me, right? And obviously, I put a lot of work into getting that back. Um, but yeah, he's one of those guys where he doesn't write a ton, but if you do get in touch with him, you'll get some interesting stuff, right? That kind of comes to another point where it's like people that are hard to write to. So I know people that specifically have relationships with certain inmates or certain people, and they've gotten all these items, but those people don't write anybody else, right? And then the same thing where I have a lot of people that I write to that don't talk to anyone else that I built a relationship with. So I have all these things that are, presumably high value. If they're not out there, nobody else can get them. Um, but sometimes it's good to network and meet somebody who, like you with Sarah Aldretti for that matter. If I'm like, hey, I got this thing, I'm interested in getting signed, or I want to get a bunch of her stuff from you in bulk. I've got this stuff from this guy who nobody else has access to. Yeah, some people just have it, like Gary Ridgway, for instance. His stuff is extremely hard to find, but he does write to some people and he writes them a lot. So there is stuff there, just not like necessarily public, right?
Yeah, and the more hard to get inmates, I have a feeling when they start, croaking, that's when stuff will start hitting the market.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of people like to hold on to stuff like Ridgeway or say Kemper or whoever, like, because that stuff's just gonna skyrocket like crazy when they pass away.
Yeah, Kemper's one of those guys who, he is alive. He's an interesting case when it comes to valuing this sort of stuff, right? So his story was always known. I mean, he was in like The Killing of America, which was this very iconic kind of shockumentary from the 80s. He's had a lot of interviews before, but he didn't kind of really pop off in the public eye until Mindhunter came out. And I think the performance the guy did playing Kemper was so good, charming, that people were like, "Oh, this guy's really interesting. I want something from him." So his stuff, I've had a couple of his letters, and they sell for a few grand each, right? But I know that he does actively write some people, and I have a feeling that those people are trying to keep a good relationship with him, and then when he passes away, more stuff will come out, right? Um, it's interesting to see that, I see Ted Bundy letters more than I see Kemper letters, and Ted Bundy like was from way earlier. He didn't write much either. His stuff is obviously very rare. He's one of the biggest names ever. Kemper's almost on his level just because it was a bit of a niche case that people caught on to late, right? Um, Ted Kaczynski is a similar way where he does have some pen pals, but he doesn't write openly too much. It's so hard to get a response from him directly. So his stuff is very valuable because of the notoriety of his case. But definitely there are people out there who have some of it, sitting around somewhere.
Right. Yeah, it's always been crazy to me that Kemper letters are worth more than like almost worth as much as like a Pogo the Clown painting or something. And when he passes away, you can bet your ass that they'll definitely be worth more than a Pogo painting.
Oh yeah, I've only ever had 2 or 3 of his letters ever, and I wish I still had one. But for a long time, I would be like, oh, I want to keep one piece from every big name. But at a certain point, it's like, okay, but I also need to make money and have a job. I'm kind of at that point again where I'm sort of leaning back into, okay, I want a piece from everybody. Notable, but as another thing too, when you get into like the big names, right? When you think of big names in true crime, you've got Dahmer, Bundy, Gacy, uh, Ramirez. I mean, those are kind of like the big four for me, at least the way I look at it. Those are like the big ones, right? And Ramirez stuff is worth nothing compared to some of these guys. Like Ramirez letters sell for $100 to $200 depending on the content, because he just wrote a lot when he was in prison. He did a lot of art in prison. His stuff is definitely, I think, a little undervalued, given the notoriety of his stuff. Whereas Gacy, for instance, you can get a letter between like $400 and $800 sometimes. Handwritten letters are pretty hard to find. Paintings are obviously expensive. We did quite a bit. And then Bundy and Dahmer are like the top dogs, where his Bundy's case is so notorious and from so long ago, his stuff is hard to get. And then Dahmer, obviously there wasn't really anything until recently out there.
Right, right. Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think about. A lot of these guys have been dead for so long, and there's
Mhm.
more out there from them than there is like Kemper or Ridgway or whoever. But who's to say that, there's like 100 Kemper letters just waiting to hit the market as soon as he passes away?
Yeah, exactly. And there's all these things where it's like you never know what's going to come to you. You know, I have people contacting me all the time saying, "Hey, I've got this for sale. I've got that item. I had a connection to this person, and I have these things." And a big concern of mine getting into this at first was, well, so many other people have been doing this for so much longer than me. How am I going to find anything new? But I've managed to find like so much stuff that nobody's ever seen before. Because it's just a matter of how you promote yourself and how you advertise yourself and how you're doing your research. You know, everyone's got different methods for sourcing, right? I buy stuff from 10 or 15 different websites from different places in the world. Um, I've got all these contacts and all these sources I check in with all the time, and I have people reaching out to me, and everybody's sourcing their stuff differently. You know, one of the items at first that I thought was kind of a neat thing, where I think I had a bit of an effect on the market is I bought I was like, okay, there isn't much Dahmer stuff. What can I find that's Dahmer related? And I thought, well, let me look for Ambrosia chocolate items, right? It's a factory that's shut down now. And then there were some promotional items on eBay. At a certain point, somebody was selling like chocolate wrappers, um, for really cheap, for super cheap. And I bought a few in bulk, and I sold them. I made a good profit on them. And then when I went to buy another batch of them, the price had tripled, right? But I still could buy some and put a profit on them. So I guess somebody figured, oh, these are selling now, we can raise the price. Nobody's thought to buy these before. And then that happened a couple of times. The price was going up and up and up. And they were sold out. And then I started seeing them on other high profile sites for more than I had been selling them for. And presumably they were still selling. And it's kind of like people are catching on to, oh, somebody found this somewhere. Let me try and figure out where they found it or how they got a hold of it and see if I can get out on this too, right?
Very, very strange world, but it's fun. It's become
Mhm.
like abnormally normal.
Mhm. Yeah. So for cult stuff specifically, because other people obviously sold cult things, but it wasn't like the biggest thing. I kind of pushed that a lot when I started doing this. For me, when it comes to people's temples items, for instance, right? The way I kind of value it is on rarity of scarcity. There were so many eras of People's Temple, like they were around in the 70s. They had different locations. I've got a few items from like pre San Francisco. I've got some items from when they were in San Francisco. I've got items from Jonestown out of Guyana, which are obviously the hardest to get because they would have had to at some point come back from the jungle in Guyana to North America, right? But those are always interesting to kind of try and value because, yeah, it's just a little esoteric, right? Jim Jones yearbook, for instance, I had one a while ago. It sold. I had somebody contact me recently with one that was pretty beat up, and they were like, "Oh, I want to give it to you as a gift because what you're doing is cool and that's great." But you look at that, and it realized it's from 1949, and the class size was like 40 people. You know, so presumably they made like what 40 copies of this yearbook. So you can kind of have a direct correlation of, oh, this there isn't that much of this out there. Um, Obviously, People's Temple when they were in full force, you know, they made a lot of stuff. The He's Able album, the LP, you find copies of that sealed all the time because they had an auction in the 70s where they or the 80s where they sold everything from the People's Temple, and somebody must have bought a box of like hundreds of sealed copies, right? Uh, and those albums still are only, a few $100, even though they're a very rare item. They've got a picture of Jim Jones on them, just because somebody found a trove of a lot of them at some point. Whereas there's certain documents that you wouldn't think would be as valuable as like an album, that are worth way more just because they're so scarce. Another thing for when it comes to the value and stuff, right? A lot of my favorite pieces in my collection, my personal stuff, are things that I didn't pay anything for or paid a couple of bucks for, right? For instance, I've got I had heard that rumors that John Waters had bought the sign from the outside of the People's Temple when they were shut down. And I found a photo of him standing outside of the People's Temple in San Francisco with that sign above it. And I had mailed him and gotten in touch, and he sent me a few autographed copies of that photo. And that's a bit like true crime adjacent, I guess, but he never confirmed as to whether or not he owned the thing, but he did sign some photos for me. That's one of my favorite things, and it costs nothing. It's cool. It's a John Waters autograph. I like his movies. Um, I contacted at some point Sheila, who was the Rajneesh cult Osho in Oregon. She was if you haven't seen the series Wild Wild Country on Netflix, is about them. She was kind of like a cult leader in a way. I got in touch with her personally and wrote to her, got a letter back. I got a signature from the principal of Columbine. I've got some signatures from some people who lived in Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, some of his neighbors. These are just people that I kind of tracked down and had an interest in and wanted to collect things from. And on the one hand, they're probably very valuable because they're one of a kind things, right? Or very unique or very rare. People haven't thought to get them before. But sentimentally, they matter to me because they're things that I sourced myself. But at the same time, they were kind of free, you know? So for me, my collection, some of my favorite stuff isn't like the big rare heavy hitter stuff. It's just the unique items that I've been able to find myself, you know, through my own research or even like making a relationship with an inmate. I have an inmate who I don't want to mention by name, but very high profile. And I got in touch with them and started writing them right before a big documentary came out. And they were paranoid before that came out. And once it came out, they like shut down, didn't talk to anyone, became very closed off. So I have a very large collection of letters and artwork and pictures from this person that nobody else has because of the fact that, you know, when his case kind of got popular, he stopped talking to anyone, and I had kind of gotten in right before that. But yeah, I mean, that's a good thing in regards to making some value because maybe I'll sell those one day and they'll be worth a lot. But at the same time, it's like the most like gratification I get collecting personally is from those unique things that I find that people aren't necessarily thinking to look for.
Right. Yeah. One of my favorite pieces in my collection was free too. And it's a Philo Jablonski painting of a rapper named Stitches. And the rapper actually signed it in gold pen because I used to be friends with his old like manager. And one of my favorite pieces in my collection is a Jablonski piece. And I know people make
That's so
fun of
funny.
Jablonski pieces, but it's like oh, technically two of a kind because his manager has the other one, but just kind of
Mhm.
random, you know, free gift of sorts that signed by a musician, which I love it.
Mhm. My favorite theoretical piece. This is an interesting story. So Sam Little, he passed away a few years ago, and he kind of came to popularity right before he died. So he had killed 93 women. It was like the highest kill count of any serial killer in the States ever. Um, but for a lot of reasons, the case just wasn't that popular. Um, but near the end of his life, he started doing these oil pastel drawings of a lot of his victims that hadn't been identified, and the FBI released them all. And it helped close a bunch of cold cases because he had a very good memory for what people looked like, and people would be like, "Oh, I recognize this person," because a lot of them were unknown, like black sex workers that are just not weren't considered worth investigating by the authorities for one reason or another. Um, the kind of the less dead, as people refer to it as, you know, people who aren't looked into or investigated because of, you know, systematic issues. But so he was doing for a while. He sent me a drawing at one point just out of nowhere after we'd been writing, and he I know was doing commissions for a little bit. Like he would say, "Hey, if you want to give me a gift of some money, I'll do a drawing for you." And I had talked to him for a bit about this because I was like, "Oh, it's kind of interesting. I'll get a little drawing done and send him a few bucks." It's not like he's making a big profit or living luxurious, right? Just getting some snacks or whatever. And I had paid him to do a pogo for me, right? And between the time when I paid him and heard back from him, he died. And then I received a letter about a week after he had died that he had written just before that, saying like, "Oh, I'm working on it. You know, I got the money, and I'm working on the drawing. It'll be done soon. I'll send it soon, right?" So somewhere there exists a Pogo the Clown done by Sam Little, or at least partially done, that I assume was just thrown out at some point. But if I had gotten that, you know, that would have been the highlight of my collection because it would be the only one he had ever done. And that kind of thing happens too. if I posted about it, I'm sure other people would go and try and get them done as well. Like Robert Bardo has drawn Pogo the Clown a lot, and Tobolsky did a lot of them. It's kind of like getting a Pogo done by anyone is sort of an interesting piece in true crime collecting, right? But yeah, that's like the one piece that got away from me, where I was like, man, that would have been some real value and a really interesting thing to have, and I just kind of missed it by a couple of days.
Yeah, that would have been America's most prolific serial killer doing a
Mhm.
painting of another prolific serial killer.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a weird world trying to figure this stuff out. At the end of the day, the way I try and price things, my kind of philosophy on it is based on, being fair and making sure that collectors can get things that they're interested in, but also not undervaluing things and making sure that the time I put into this is worth it, right? Because I put in like well over 40 hours a week into this job. I work very weird hours all over the place. I do weird sourcing. I have to go to physical locations sometimes to find things. There's just a lot of stuff behind running this operation. And I always try and keep in mind, if I post something around, like, oh, maybe it's a little much. I got to think about the fact that, if I pay $100 for an item and sell it for $500, technically I'm making a $400 profit, but it might have taken me, you know, 200 hours to find that one piece and get the deal closed, right? So when you think about it as an hourly wage, it's way less than like even $10 an hour. But having all those things going on at once, or a lot of those deals going on at once, kind of evens it out a little bit. But yeah, I feel like this is a hobby where it's the value and the money is in the right place. Anybody who wants to start collecting can get in at any financial level. When it comes to big high end stuff, there's ways to do trades for people, or payment plans, or yeah, I think it's very accessible. Obviously some things are very valuable and expensive, but you don't need that to be collecting, right? You don't need to have a John Wayne Gacy painting. You could have a signature, and that's going to be cheaper. You could have a copy of the Psycho Killer's comic book that he did the cover of, the Pogo the Clown cover, for $100. If you want to have a piece from him. There's just a lot of options for people in this. I think it's very interesting. Like, I know people that collected so many different financial levels in this hobby.
Yeah, and you don't have to have Gacy or Manson or whatever to be like considered a collector. I hate when
Oh yeah.
I hate when people say like you're not a collector because you have Jablonski or Henley or whatever. Like, you don't have a Gacy painting, you don't have a Ted Bundy signature. Like, you know, a collection is a collection, whether it's relics or dirt or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah, Jared. I mean, I got when I'm here from the Heaven's Gate mansion, right? And that's just like a bit of a sentimental thing, because I went with a buddy. We went together, took some photos. It's a cool little like souvenir of that. Um, taking photos of notorious places and having like an album of photos of places you've gone to, writing to people and getting letters back and having letters that you essentially paid stamps for. All of those things kind of add together and make for um, a very unique and interesting kind of dynamic for all this stuff.
Definitely a interesting, fun, thought-provoking hobby, to say the
Mhm.
least.
Oh, for sure.
Well, I think we can get out of here unless you have anything else to add.
No, no. I mean, I would say that we've done a good handful of episodes now. I'm sure that some people listening have some questions about stuff. It would be cool to do like a Q&A episode soon. So maybe if I'll put a little message out that if anybody has questions, leave the comments on my YouTube if you're watching it there, or Andrew's YouTube, or any of the platforms, or email either of us, or DM us or whatever. We'd be happy to do, like, it'd be cool to have a big list of questions to go through about either things we've talked about on the show so far, or ideas for the future. Yeah, maybe we'll try and get one of those done in the next few months. Like, if anyone's curious about anything we've talked about in more depth.
Yeah, that sounds fun, and we can put a little post out there as well, so we can get some questions and
Yeah,
get it rolling.
sure. Perfect.
Sweet.
Okay, yeah, well, that's it for now. Thanks everybody for watching.